2 years before General Magic ever shipped a product, a different company had already built, demonstrated, and sold something the world wouldn't have a name for until years later. It had a touchscreen, it sent faxes and emails, it made phone calls. And it came from a company most people today associate with old mainframes and business suits, not pocket computers. The company was IBM, the device was called Simon. And it might be the single most overlooked first in the entire history of consumer technology, a smartphone that shipped and sold to real customers. 13 years before the word smartphone meant anything to anyone. The story starts in July of 1992. Inside IBM's Advanced Technology Department in Boca Raton, Florida, with an engineer named Frank Canova. Canova had noticed something most of the industry hadn't fully connected yet. Computer chips were shrinking fast, based on advances in transistor technology. And cellular networks were spreading across the country. And the overlap between those two trends meant something new was becoming physically possible. A device that combined a personal digital assistant with an actual working phone. Small enough to carry in a pocket rather than a briefcase. Canova pitched the idea to management using a working demo. A touchscreen wired under a table to a regular computer running Visual Basic, simulating what a real handheld version could eventually do. Complete with a familiar button-based interface instead of a command line style operating system. Management didn't just approve it. They pulled engineers from other projects and gave Canova 15 weeks to build a working, standalone demo unit in time for COMDEX, one of the largest technology trade shows in the world at the time. 15 weeks for a device with no real precedent to point to. The team hit that deadline. On November 23, 1992, IBM unveiled the prototype at COMDEX in Las Vegas under the internal code name Sweet Spot. It made enough of an impression that USA Today ran a front-page photo the very next day, showing Canova holding the device in the paper's money section. Here's a detail almost nobody knows about that demo. Because consumer internet access wasn't remotely mature yet in 1992, there was no way to show a live stock ticker or real news feed on the device. So Canova simply scanned a physical newspaper and displayed a static image of the stock market on the touchscreen instead, just to demonstrate the idea of what a smartphone screen could someday show you. At the time, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was sitting at around 3,260 points, a number that would climb roughly tenfold in the following 3 decades. After the prototype's success at COMDEX, IBM moved from concept to actual product under a new internal code name. Angler. To pull it off, IBM partnered with 2 companies most people wouldn't expect. Motorola provided cellular radio technology adapted from its own flip phones, along with licensed battery technology. Even though Motorola would later become a smartphone competitor in its own right. And Mitsubishi Electric was brought in as the manufacturing partner, integrating its own PDA and cellular radio experience directly into the hardware. The finished commercial device was unveiled at the Wireless World Conference in November of 1993, and finally went on public sale on August 15, 1994. Sold through Bell South Cellular across 15 states on Bell South Cellular Network. IBM and Bell South didn't call it a smartphone. That word barely existed yet. They marketed it simply as a personal communicator, but by nearly every functional definition we use today. Simon was the real thing. It had a touchscreen you operated with your finger or a stylus. It could make and receive phone calls. It could send and receive faxes. It handled email, and it came preloaded with 11 built-in applications. A calendar and address book, a calculator, an appointment scheduler, a to-do list. A world clock, an electronic sketchpad you could draw or write on, and an on-screen keyboard for typing, alongside the ability to add handwritten annotations directly onto documents. Years before that kind of stylus input became a selling point on other devices entirely. The price tag reflected exactly how far ahead of its infrastructure it was. $899 with a 2-year service contract, or $1,099 without one, somewhere around $2,000 to $2,200 in today's money. For a device most people had no cultural framework yet for understanding, let alone a clear reason to spend that kind of money on. And it had one brutal, unavoidable limitation: the battery lasted about 1 hour. Simon stayed on the market for exactly 6 months. By February of 1995, it was discontinued, having sold approximately 50,000 units in total. For comparison, that's roughly what a single mid-sized city's worth of iPhone sells in an average afternoon today. The reasons it failed read almost like a checklist of too early, symptoms we'd later see again and again across the industry. The battery couldn't support real all-day use, forcing owners to plan their entire day around finding an outlet. Cellular data networks weren't remotely built out enough to make the internet features genuinely useful, even when the hardware itself was technically capable of using them. The price was aimed at business travelers and early adopters rather than ordinary consumers, positioning Simon closer to a corporate expense account purchase than something anyone would casually pick up in a store. And the entire concept of a phone that's also a small computer simply hadn't entered the public imagination yet. There was no cultural expectation to sell into, no existing daily habit to build on top of. IBM had to convince people they needed something nobody had ever needed before, using infrastructure that couldn't fully support the idea yet. Sold through a single regional carrier rather than a broad national launch. 2 years later, when General Magic and Sony released the Magic Link with many of these same basic concepts, they ran into strikingly similar problems: slow networks, short battery life, and a buying public that still wasn't ready to carry a computer everywhere. Neither team appears to have been working from the other's playbook. The Simon and the Magic Link weren't really competitors so much as two separate teams, working independently on opposite sides of the same industry, both discovering the exact same hard truth about timing at almost the exact same moment in history: that being technically correct, years ahead of a market, is not the same thing as being ready to sell to that market. The word smartphone itself wouldn't fully enter common use until 1997, when Ericsson used it to describe a concept device called the GS88. By the time Apple's iPhone launched in January of 2007, redefining the category for good and becoming the reference point everyone now measures every phone against, Simon had already been sitting quietly in tech history for 13 years, largely forgotten outside of small circles of collectors, historians, and the occasional museum display case. Frank Canova is now generally credited by historians as the inventor of the smartphone concept. Full stop, not a footnote before the real one, but the person who actually built and shipped the first one, over a decade before the term existed to describe what he'd made. Working with a team that had 15 weeks and no real precedent to build from. What makes Simon worth remembering isn't just that it was first. It's that being first, in this specific case, meant almost nothing commercially. The infrastructure, the batteries, the networks, the cultural habit of carrying a screen everywhere, had to catch up over more than a decade before an idea this correct could actually work as a business. IBM built the future exactly on schedule. The rest of the world just wasn't on that same schedule yet, and wouldn't be for another 13 years. End of line. Technology that almost changed everything. Subscribe because the next line ends soon.